uh, tell us a little bit about yourself and what has brought you to the point of helping to establish the Writers Action Team, or the Writers Action Group.
Yes, thank you so much, Wendell. And I'm really glad to be on this show, and I know wonderful things about you. And I think that it takes one, I don't know if it would be superhuman or subhuman or whatever you would call us, one exceptional person to recognize another. And I'm really honored to know you. Um, I think that one of the ways that I've ended up where I am now is that I've made an awful lot of mistakes. And so I think that I've managed to bounce back from them, and I've managed to learn from them. And I think that I've tried to take my mistakes and what I have failed at and what my bosses have failed at and the initiatives that I've failed at, and I've tried to learn from them and bring that wisdom to a political process that I believe is fundamentally in need of better storytelling techniques. So, shortest version of my story is that I was a civil rights lawyer out of University of Pennsylvania Law School. One of my professors was Elizabeth Warren, and I found that practicing civil rights law was quite depressing if you're a plaintiff's attorney. If you're arguing on behalf of civil rights as opposed to defending against civil rights, it's very hard because civil rights law, as you know, I'm sure, Wendell, is federal law.
Right.
And the federal courts have been stacked with Republican judges for as long as I've been a lawyer. And it's only gotten more severe now. So I decided to quit the practice of law, and I went down to Washington, and I became staff of the Senate Labor Committee, where I could write civil rights law. I started with Joe Lieberman, then John Kerry, then Ted Kennedy and Paul Wellstone. So as you can see, I moved further and further to the left in my process. And for 4 years, I was joint counsel to both Ted Kennedy and Paul Wellstone, which was one of the most exciting periods of my life. And for a liberal in Washington in my 20s, it was a dream come true. And then the dream was shattered because Paul Wellstone died in a plane crash. And it was a plane that I don't want to exaggerate. I don't want to say that I had a ticket on that plane or anything. But it was a plane I theoretically could have been on. Every member of the Wellstone staff felt that way. And none of us had an easy time transitioning to his death. We're all still living with his death. My reaction might have been perhaps more extreme than some of the others. I sold all of my possessions. I left Washington, bought a sailboat, and started sailing around the world. And I landed, after about 2 years of sailing full time, I landed in Los Angeles, where I became a television writer. And the first script that I wrote was a West Wing, an episode of The West Wing. It was not shot, but that's how you break into the business, by writing an episode of a good show. And I ended up writing, after the West Wing episode got me offices representation from all the major agencies, I went with CAA, and then I became a writer for a TV show called Century City, which starred a little-known actress named Viola Davis. And then by the time the episode that I wrote ended up on the air, I was already hired by Law & Order SVU, and then The Closer, and then Saving Grace with Holly Hunter, and then Fairly Legal. And then I started selling shows, and I've been selling shows for the last 9 years on a huge array of topics, from astronauts to politics to psychedelic drugs to international diplomacy and on. But when Trump was elected, and I use mild quotes, he was elected. If your viewers could see me right now, I'm holding up 2 fingers on either side of the word. I realized, and a lot of my compatriots here in Los Angeles realized, that the Democratic Party needed to have a better shot at getting its own story out to certainly its own base, but beyond its base. And I started going to Washington and bringing writers with me. And we gave speeches to the entire Democratic caucus in the Senate, and we gave speeches to the entire Democratic caucus in the House, and all the press secretaries and communications directors. And we got invited back again and again, and we started doing candidate training, and we started doing, working with office holders on crafting message. And that has become a huge part of my life, to the point where during this most recent blue wave, I was consulting with at least 6 members of the House who ultimately won by a very small margin. And I like to think that I made a difference, and my group made a difference. And certainly the people we helped believe that. One of them, a congresswoman named Mary Gay Scanlon, once she won, she immediately hired me to come to Washington as a senior staff and advisor on an interim basis and help set up her office. And I did. And so up until last Thursday, I was congressional staff. And it was fantastic working with her. She's an amazing woman and she has an amazing staff. And one of the things I helped her write was a piece of legislation called the Inaugural Funds Integrity Act, which basically says that currently inaugural donations to inaugural committee are slush fund. There's no regulations around. And we just started, and the bill places ordinary campaign donation restrictions on inaugural fund donations, including reporting requirements, including reasonable limits, etc. And I'm happy to say that the bill that ultimately she delivered and that was introduced at the end, one of the last bills that was introduced in the last Congress, has now been folded into and become part of the first bill that the Democrats have been introduced in this Congress. It is now part of H.R. 1. And so I think that I'm saying all this not to, puff myself up. I'm saying this to let everybody know and your listeners know that if you have something to contribute to the political process, offer it. Because it's amazing what can be accomplished in a political context if you throw yourself into it and you offer the skills that you possess.
How are you taking it to the next, maybe the next election? You've had some successes in this 2018 cycle. As you look to 2020, what are you hoping to accomplish? And tell us a bit about the group you've pulled together and how they will actually be operating.
Well, I think that the road to 2020 goes through the 2019. So the 2019 elections are going to be incredibly important. Those are the state and local elections, the off-year elections, the super off-year, because sometimes 2020 is considered 2018 was considered to be off-year because it wasn't a presidential. 2019 even more of an off-year. But the state, one of the things that the Republicans, I think, really learned a long time before the Democrats to virtually every Democrat running for office in 2019. So the kind of services that we offer are, first of all, what we call Find Your Story seminars. Now, Find Your Story seminar is when we work directly with a candidate or office holder, and we work with them on uncovering their own genesis story, almost like they're a TV character themselves. Where does your passion come from? When did you decide to run for office? When did you decide to get involved in politics, and why? What drove you? Where is your passion? Where is your mission? Where is your heart? Because what we've learned is that once people really identify with that, and then once we help them tell that story using the cutting edge of storytelling techniques, then the issue of authenticity disappears. When you're connected to your own emotional content, when you're connected to your own emotional core, you speak with authenticity naturally. Authenticity really just means that your words are connected to your emotions. And we have a theory, which is to why Democrats have fallen away from that path of authenticity. And it's because about 30 years ago, during the Reagan, maybe a little bit longer, during the Reagan years, the Republicans, I believe, and this is a personal view, but I'm sure a lot of Democrats share it, the Republicans stopped arguing the facts. They didn't have the right side of the argument, but they figured the way to win and the way to win people over, and this was Reagan's technique, was to appeal to their emotions. So the Republicans started focusing on appealing to people's emotions, very often their fears. And in Reagan's case also, their hopes. Democrats got frustrated by that because we believed that we were right. We were right on the facts. We were right on the information. We had the right policies. And so we stayed in the left brain of arguing facts and figures and getting irritated and starting to sound elitist and starting to look down on people who were reacting to the emotional arguments. And that's where the real disconnect began. The Republicans knew how to argue feelings because they knew it worked. The Democrats just stayed with facts and figures, and we started sounding elitist and disconnected. What we need to do now is we need to add, I'm not saying we shouldn't argue facts and figures, and I believe as a Democrat that we're right on the facts and figures. But we need to add emotional storytelling skills to that mix. We have to have that tool in the shed, and we have to be able to use it effectively. So, Find Your Story seminars are what we do to get people down that path. Your own Genesis story, and your own Genesis story told well and emotionally, involving the senses, involving visual images, involving anecdotes that make you, the speaker, feel something very deeply. Because the general rule is, unless you're feeling something deeply when you're addressing a large audience, or a podcast for that matter, the audience isn't going to feel anything either. So we start with the emotional reaction of the storyteller. The next thing we do is we offer what's called Turning Issues into Stories seminars. And Turning Issues into Stories seminars help people take any issue that they're dealing with and you find the narrative that illustrates it in a powerful and passionate and engaging way. And those seminars have been incredibly effective. The third thing that we do is we work with fundraising letters, because the reality is money matters, especially with so many Democrats now foregoing super PACs. They need to be able to make emotional, effective appeals. And I don't know about you, Wendell, but as a Democratic voter and donor, I am very sick of receiving what even Keith Ellison has called ransom notes. The letters that are written by the majority of the Democratic Party feel urgent without substance. They feel like noise, and they don't necessarily inspire donations. We have in the Writers Action Group up to 200 members of the Writers Guild of America, a lot of them award winners. We have Tom Schulman, who wrote Dead Poet Society, Callie Curry, who wrote Thelma and Louise, Tim Kring, who wrote Heroes. We have incredible writers. And by using their skills, and forgive me, my voice gets a little bit sore after a time. By using these storytelling skills in fundraising letters, we have found that we can raise the bar for the amount of donations that can be given off of an average letter. And the end result is, with more money, there's more of an ability to get the message out. Because of our fundraising letters, the people we work with, very often, their brand is shaped just a little bit more. Their own talking points are shaped a little bit more. Their stump speeches are shaped a little bit more. It really works. And then, of course, the fourth thing that we do is just simple speeches. We work with speeches, and we work with teaching people how to deliver those speeches. We have directors on our team, directors like Marshall Hershkovitz, who is an Emmy Award-winning, the Emmy Award-winning creator of 30-something. And we help people take their message and deliver it in a way, on camera, in person, in front of large rooms, that get people on their feet, that get people's blood pressure up, and that get results.
And you work one-on-one with candidates in that regard?
Yes, we're one-on-one. And one of the ways that also manifests is we do a lot of debate prep. But we also work in groups. We are the lead. We are one of the candidate trainers for the PCCC, which is the Progressive Change Campaign Committee.
Right.
We work with the New Leaders Council. We work with the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, which is the organization run by the Democratic Party that helps state and local candidates around the country, over 6,000 candidates around the country. And we're also doing outreach right now to other groups that do candidate training and offering our services at their gatherings and at their events.
Roger, the reason that we started this podcast was to help people understand why we think the way we do, and why people vote the way they vote, why they spend money the way they spend money, and to help people understand what influences there are that they're completely unaware of in most cases, for them to do what they do. How does this relate to what you're doing and what you've observed, and why do you think, I know that one of your concerns is about the increasing polarization of our political discourse. What has contributed to that, and what role has has propaganda played in that polarization?
That's an excellent question, Wendell. And this is we could definitely fill out the rest of the hour on this alone, if not many hours. And I do have thoughts on it, and I'd be really curious as to yours as well. I think that first of all, the difference between the liberal and the Republican, the liberal and the conservative mind, tends to be that the liberal mind, in my view, tends to have a larger sphere of compassion. That doesn't mean that we have more compassion in total. It just means that our sphere extends larger than just our tribe, our city, our state, our country, our populace, our species even. You know, the average liberal cares about animals, cares about the environment, cares about other countries. The average conservative, and I'm not making any value judgment here, the average conservative may very well love their family and their community even more than the average liberal. But I believe that their sphere of compassion tends to be a little bit tighter and more restricted. And therefore, they're a little bit less concerned about what goes on in the rest of the world. That's my personal view. It might be incredibly offensive to some, but I could probably back it up. Second of all, I think that the average conservative voter tends to be a little bit more fear-based. And don't get me wrong, liberals can be plenty fear-based, and we have a lot to be afraid of. But I think that you can motivate a conservative viewer a little bit more with fear than a liberal voter. Liberal voters tend to be motivated less by fear and more by a desire to build something. Now, again, these are massive value judgments, and I'd be really up for a debate on any of them. But that's been my personal observation. And as for propaganda, one of my oldest friends actually is Frank Luntz. And I'm sure you know who Frank is, and you too, Joey. And I'm sure that a lot of your viewers do. But Frank Luntz is a wordsmith of the highest order, and I respect him very much. He's the one who wrote the Contract with America for Newt Gingrich, and he's the one who came up with terms like climate change instead of global warming, and the death tax instead of inheritance tax. And I don't think I can really, even though I object to what the results are from Frank Luntz, I can't object to his intelligence. He basically figured out that if you can name an issue or a debate on your own terms as a conservative, because he's a conservative, then you move the ball downfield in the direction that you want to go without even spending any money, without spending any capital. And he's right. And I think the Democrats have a harder time doing that than the Republicans, in part because I think that the Republican Party is a political party, and the Democratic Party, by virtue of its diversity, is more of a coalition of disparate groups. So the Democrats have a harder time singing from the same playbook. Again, no, I don't think there's any value judgment in that. I'm not saying that Republicans are better or worse than Democrats. I'm just saying that the Republicans tend to be more cohesive, more homogeneous, and the Democrats tend to be more diverse and therefore have a harder time agreeing on things. I have been working on a language guide with the Democratic Party that has the buy-in from a lot of high-profile Democrats, and yet we still haven't been able to get some of my terms out there. Like, for example, rather than call the safety net the safety net, I'm recommending to the Democrats that we use the word safety network. Now, as you can see, it's a very small shift. It's almost small if you don't notice it, which is frankly what makes it easier to work into parlance. But safety net, what does that make you envision? To me, a safety net makes me think of something that people get caught in, right? A net catches people. It's something you fall into and get trapped in. But a network is something that supports you. It's a group of individuals working towards a common cause. So, and that to me is more what the safety network should be anyway. So we're recommending that the Democrats use the term safety network. There's a whole host of other terms. I also believe that rather than calling things like paid family leave, it should be earned family leave. Because people have already paid into it. They've already paid into that system. So they have earned their time off. It should be called earned family leave. Things like that, they're very small, but when you can get them accepted and embraced in the common parlance, then a much better chance of moving the ball in the direction you want to go.
Along those lines, the term entitlement and entitlement programs came to mind. How would you encourage people to respond to that, or use an alternative term, or has that become a negative for Democrats?
Entitlement is a terrible word. It makes it sound privileged. It makes it sound entitled. It makes it sound elitist. It makes it sound like people are spoiled to get it. The term that we prefer to use is earned benefits. Simple as that. You've earned them, and they're benefits. Now, there's probably even a better term in there, but that's the best we've come up with so far.
So I'm sure there's going to be listeners that are going to be conservative, and they might be thinking, oh, look, Hollywood helping out liberal politicians. I'm sure that there are people on the right that have your job, and from what you're saying, they've been successful for years. Can you respond to that criticism?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the Writers' Action Group itself isn't based in Los Angeles. We have members in New York. We have members in Washington, D.C. We have playwrights. We have former journalists. We're just writers. We're not we tend to be from the entertainment industry, but we're not Hollywood types. I've had an equal amount of political experience as writing experience. I've spent as much time in Washington, D.C. as I have in Los Angeles. And yes, the Republicans have their own wordsmiths. They have their own people who work with language and work with storytelling techniques. And some of them are very effective, like Frank Luntz.
Luntz. This is really terrific, Roger. You mentioned Frank Luntz, and I am very familiar with his work. I've never met him, but I've been a big fan of his work. I read Words That Work when I was in my old job in the insurance business. I know how influential he was, and during the debate on the Affordable Care Act, I was in Washington a lot, and I know that a lot of the Republicans who, in fact, most of the Republicans who were opposed to that legislation were very disciplined in the language they used against it. They used the term a government takeover of healthcare in particular. And we will see something similar emerge again as legislation we're going to have hearings on Medicare for all for the first time. There will be another debate on where we go from here in healthcare.
Right.
How do you take what we know happened in 2008 and how it influenced people's opinion of the legislation that was that came out of that, and bring it into 2019 and 2020? What do we learn from that?
Well, what specifically are you referring to in 2008, Wendell?
The legislation as it was being debated and written in Congress, and at the moment, actually, when the House voted on the legislation, almost every Republican in the chamber went to the well and called that piece of legislation a government takeover of healthcare, and that legislation would be creating death panels. So the language was very specific. They were very disciplined. It was kind of remarkable. If you look at the Federal Register, about how many actually said that or some variation of that. Uh, but I've never seen Democrats be quite that disciplined, quite that. And you spoke to that a few minutes ago about the
Right.
reason why that is. But what I would expect that we will hear the same language as we look at healthcare one more time, or the next time it's debated.
Yeah, and I'm definitely, well, I'm afraid of pretty much every debate, in part because I really do think that the Republicans will always get a little bit of a jump on us, and in part because they're trained to do it. You can't fault a winning strategy. I think they're in part because of their homogeneity, as I mentioned earlier. In part because, from my personal view, and this is a strong statement, and I almost apologize in advance to your more conservative listeners, but I really believe that the Republican Party marches lockstep with corporate interests. And corporations, and for I believe, and again, this is a controversial point, but I believe that liberal policies are better for the economy in the long run. They may not be better for the economy in the short run. Tax hikes on the wealthy don't give an immediate punch to the economy the same way that a tax cut for the wealthy gives an immediate punch to the economy. But over the long run, it pays off. Fair antitrust policies don't do well for the stock of the companies that are being broken up or being kept from conglomerating in the short run. But in the long run, they lead for better prices for consumers and more competition in the industry, and we all benefit in the long run. So I feel as though the Republican Party sometimes is focused on the short-term best interests of the wealthiest and of wealthy corporations. And when that is your goal, and when that's where your campaign donations are coming from, and that's what you're looped into and communicating with the largest basis, it's very easy to just pick a term that sits well with them and everybody use it. Democrats, I believe, are hearing a lot of different voices, and they're not ignoring the voices of the wealthy. They can't, especially because of the way campaign finance laws are written these days. Democrats take money from a lot of the same sources, which frustrates me, but they do. So they're hearing those voices, and they're hearing the voices of their constituents who have less, and nonprofits that have less. And so it's harder for the Democrats to coalesce around certain terms. I would also make the argument that very often the Democrats aren't as good at coming up with terms. Frank Luntz is not only a genius, but he also is a focus group manager. He speaks to hundreds, if not thousands, of average voters every month. The reason why I believe the Writers' Action Group can be an effective counterpart to what he does is that we may not speak to average voters in a room in front of us 5 slices of pizza every month, but we are listening to our viewers and our massive pool of millions of viewers every single day. We are reacting what they say. We are learning instinctively how to communicate with them, how to connect to them, how to move them. And I think that that's why we're able to, a group like mine, is able to name things in a way that can really be effective, is able to argue for things in a way that can really be effective. And the Democratic Party is starting to connect to that. That's one of the reasons why we've had good success, and that's one of the reasons why I believe our organization has a really good future.
Just one or two more questions, and we'll let you go. But regarding that language guide that you've referenced, just to take an example or two, instead of regulations, say protections. How did you decide, maybe touching on what you just said about how what the work that you've done and listening, did you come up with, instead of this, say that?
A lot of that is instinct. It really is. It has to do with having been counsel or even chief counsel to 4 U.S. senators, and having been staff to a congresswoman just very recently, and having written for as many TV shows. And it just makes sense. Like, so it seems, I think, Wendelin, you've seen our guide. That is one of our suggestions. Regulations is a terrible word. It's just terrible. It sounds irritating. I don't want to be regulated. It's got the word regular in there. It's everything about it. All the connotations are negative. But I like to be protected. Everyone likes to be protected. And ultimately, an effective regulation is an effective protection. So that's one of the terms that we suggest. We have not focus grouped it, although perhaps we will at some point. But on an instinctive level, it makes sense. Now, if we were to focus group it the way that Frank Luntz does, we might have an easier time with the Democratic Party taking it on, and perhaps we will at some point. But we also like the idea of not focus grouping everything. Focus groups don't always get it right.
One thing that I wanted to ask you, we've mentioned Frank Luntz. He's been active and very successful and influential for a number of years. I haven't seen many on the left or for Democrats. George Lakoff comes to mind. His work has never gotten traction as Frank's has, working with I think progressive or Democratic candidates. Why is it taking so long for you guys to do what you're doing? Why did it have to be you to do this?
Well, first of all, a lot of people have tried. We're the last on a long list of people who have tried. Yeah. And I think that some people, like George Lakoff, have had a measure of success. I think that what took me personally this long was I didn't want to. I was involved in politics as little as I could while I was writing full-time for TV shows. I was still hurt and wounded by Paul Wellstone's death, and I still am. And I had other things that I wanted to focus on. I wanted to put politics behind me on some level. But then my former boss, John Kerry, ran for president, and I got a little bit involved in that. And then my former law professor, Elizabeth Warren, ran for Senate, and I got involved in that. And then Hillary Clinton ran for president, and I did a little bit of debate prep work just by offering some information to Mignon Moore that then ended up by hopefully getting in front of the candidate. But it was very minor. When Trump got elected, that changed everything. It meant to me and to many of my compatriots who are in the creative fields that we can't be on the sidelines anymore. We can't put it behind us. It's sort of like, using an entertainment reference, the movie Live, Die, Repeat with Tom Cruise. At one point, I don't know if you've seen the movie, it's really lovely, but at one point towards the end of the movie, after dying multiple times trying to fend off this alien invasion, Tom Cruise just gives up and heads to London and tries to pretend like he doesn't need to be involved. But quite poignantly, the aliens still find him. I think that what we've really learned as writers is that we can bury our head in the sand all we want, but this process is going to find us. We need the help. This is for self-preservation. I don't believe that this country can survive Trump winning re-election. I'm concerned about whether this country can survive the kind of majority that the Republicans now have on the Supreme Court. I'm more concerned about that than the White House. I don't know if democracy is going to make it. I think we're in literally being able to look at these questions and ask seriously, what is the future of this planet going to look like without America, without the United States as a beacon of hope and a beacon of freedom? Because that's not what we stand for anymore. That's not the way the world sees us. That's not the way our own citizens see us anymore. I don't think we have a choice. And so on some level, even though I would rather just be sitting at my computer or sitting on set writing TV shows, I feel like I don't have a choice. And a lot of the writers I'm working with feel the same way. And given that we've been able to develop a track record in the last election, and given the fact that the Democratic Party seems to be listening to us and taking our guidance, slowly at first and then growing a little bit, I think that this is a little bit of a marriage made in heaven. Storytellers and the Democratic Party working hand in hand, trying to get the American public to connect to us by our connecting to them.
Roger, thank you so much. Joe, do you have anything else to
No, we have so much that we could do a whole show on like the power of the euphemism with you. Like I think there's just so much that we could do, but this is great. This is it's awesome.
And I want to circle back to you separately.
I would love to come back.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, we'd like that. And I will also get back to you because I would like to figure out a way to engage the group on some of the things that we talked about the other day. And my role. Yeah.
We can do something on, first of all, obviously we want to work with you, Wendell. And we're really excited because Scott Carter has told me so much about you, and I'm just thrilled to ask the questions that you've asked of me to you. But we can do sessions on just the language guide. We can do a session on how to talk about business, which is your focus. We can do a section on pretty much anything you want, and I can also bring writers with me for eye candy, for interest, for perspective. You know, we've got some good writers that I can bring on.
Great. We'll do this, Roger. We'll do it. And I'm really grateful to Scott for connecting us. He's a great guy, isn't he?
He's amazing. Yeah. He's amazing.
Yeah.
And so are you. It's really nice to meet you, Joe.
Great to meet you.
Good to meet you, Roger. Thanks so much.
Talk to you guys soon.
Bye-bye now.